द्विवेदी एंड सायतन दासगुप्ता। दुनिया भर में 2 सहस्राब्दियों पूर्व से प्रकृति और प्राकृतिक संसार विभिन्न रूपों से साहित्यिक रचनाओं में अभिकल्पित होते रहे हैं। प्राचीन काल से भारत में भी संस्कृत और तमिल से लेकर आधुनिक काल की विभिन्न भाषाओं में न केवल प्रकृति चित्रण बल्कि प्राकृतिक संसार के साथ मनुष्य के संबंधों का चित्रण भी मिलता है। पिछली आधी शताब्दी से भी ज़्यादा समय से साहित्यिक अध्ययन के क्षेत्र में पर्यावरणीय समालोचना ने मनुष्य के साथ पर्यावरण के संबंधों को महत्वपूर्ण माना है। मानव जीवन के असमन्वय के खतरे के रूप में उपस्थित जलवायु संकट को देखते हुए पर्यावरण एवं प्रकृति के साहित्यिक प्रतिनिधित्व पर होने वाला विमर्श सामान्य संवादों से ऊपर उठकर विश्वसनीय समाधान भी सुझाता है। यह सत्र भारतीय साहित्य में प्रकृति और पर्यावरण के विभिन्न प्रतिनिधित्व एवं पर्यावरणीय आलोचनाओं पर विचार विमर्श है। Over the past 2 millennia and across the world, nature and the natural world have been imagined through literary texts in a variety of ways. In India, we have literary texts in Sanskrit and Tamil from the ancient times to many languages of the modern period that have not only depictions of the nature but also of humans' relations with the natural world. Over the past half a century, ecocriticism as a field of literary study that considers the relationship that human beings have to the environment has become important with the threat of disintegration of human life on the face of climate crisis. The discussions on the literary representations of environment and nature go beyond the routine dialogue and suggest plausible solutions too. This session is a discussion on ecocriticism and varied representation of nature and environment in Indian literature. So before formally starting the session, I would request Mr. Uday Narayan Singh ji to please come upon the stage to facilitate the welcome of our respected guest on the dais. सुश्री माला श्रीलाल आज की अध्यक्षता कर रही हैं। सुश्री Srimati. It's always better to have a yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for the honors. So now, with your permission, ma'am, I would like to hand over you the session because I will read the introductions of each speaker. So you decide the order, I'll read. Yeah. And I wish it would be an interactive session or maybe whatever format you decide. Yeah.
Good afternoon, good evening. It's very heartening to see a lovely audience at 5:45 in the evening of the first day. And indeed, it's a very special subject because eco-criticism is now the buzzword because the climate change crisis and all the other global warming that we are facing as an international concern is something that's making literature people also talk about eco-criticism. But as was just said by the person conducting the session, if you look at Indian literature, the story is much older. To begin with, I'll just say a few words about the little work that Namita Gokhale and I had done with reference to Sita. When we did this book in 2009, our emphasis was on Sita as the earth goddess. Because here she was born of the earth, and then when she wished to leave the world, she was embraced by the earth. Now, if that isn't an eco-criticism, what is? So indeed, it is quite right that although the term eco-criticism has come into literary discourse and theory, very recently in the West, as late as 1978. When you look at older Indian literature in various languages, the idea of interdisciplinarity, the idea of interrelatedness, the fact that human life, animal life, natural life, flora, fauna, everything flows together, is part and parcel of the literature of this country. So I will leave my opening remarks at this point for now, and maybe pick it up towards the end. Move on to my speakers. The first speaker is Mr. Dr. Dhananjay Singh. Each speaker can take about 10 minutes, 12 minutes, so that we have discussion time later. Dhananjay has a flight to catch, so please excuse him if he has to leave the stage after giving his talk.
So I'll take the opportunity to introduce Mr. Dhananjay Singh. He is a noted writer, poet, and a critique. He is the author of the monographs, Fables in the Indian Narrative Tradition, An Analytical Study and the Poetics of Theatre in Early India, and the forthcoming Philosophy of Performance in India. He worked as assistant editor in the prestigious project titled The Encyclopedia of Indian Poetics with Professor Kapil Kapoor as the chief editor, a project of Sahitya Academy. For his work on Samishini and Buddhist epistemology in a comparative framework, he was awarded research secondment by the European Union's Marie Curie International Research Exchange Scheme to the project Social Performance, Cultural Trauma and Re-establishing Solid Sovereignties at Trinity College, Dublin. With these lines, I would like to invite Dhananjay Singh.
Thank you so much, Honorable Professor Malashilal, my colleagues, JNU, Professor Prasad, Professor Mishra, Professor Shiv Prakash, Professor Sanjukta, everybody, Sudeep ji, and everyone, and my colleagues on the dais. Professor Malashilal ji has made my, in fact, work easier, because that's what I wanted to move to, and which of course is this, that eco-criticism and consciousness about eco-critical thoughts and representation in literature is really a major occupation with writers across the globe, especially writers who are writing from the margins in different countries. But ecological consciousness has been very predominant. Predominant is not right word to use, because there's something inherent in the classical Indian traditions. In literature, when we talk about epics, obviously, the Ramayana that Professor Malashilalji talked about, or Mahabharata, Buddha's Jatakas, and also what comes to mind is Theri Gathas, of course, the first poetry by women in the Indian tradition, and the use of nature and landscape, obviously, as modes to experience one's varying moods and ideas and assertions. So what I'm going to do today is going to pick up some of the ideas and concepts in classical Indian thought, in philosophy, and to sort of kind of present before you the eco-critical ideas that are there in them. And these ideas, of course, manifest as illustration as well as they're constitutive of the of moods, of themes, of issues which move beyond the text. So what I seek to argue is this, that in a pre-modern kind of aesthetics or poetics, the theoretical concepts originate out of these, out of eco-critical, or if you want to use a better, another phrase, of course, seeing a syncretic relation between the human and the natural world. That's what I'm trying to argue, and this is in philosophy, in literature, and in living cultural practices. So experiences of nature, of course, or environmental realities are exploited and used as both, as I said, illustrations of experience, and also constitute the ideas, of course, ideas of, let's say, coexistence of different beings. In particular, I'll talk about theories of Sphota, in poetics, theories of Sphota and Dhvani and Rasa, and also touch briefly on an area which do not have expertise, but something which is exceptionally gives a special learning experience, which is Tolkappiyam and which is Tenai poetics. The idea, and where does this come from? Why did early Indians think of this inseparable affinity between aesthetics, between poetics, and the natural world? And of course, it came from this idea that there is a oneness of being, of course, which is inseparable, and therefore, writers or poets or critics, reflected upon intrinsic relation. For instance, Rajshekhar uses a word called pravritti, of course, which becomes a major term. Of course, he borrows it from Bharatanatyam Shastra, a term that he gets developed as the regional manifestations of universal experiences in literature. And of course, that comes from a philosophy of language which says that a word has an inherent potency, an object has an inherent potency. So not only become meaning, but also an ability to create an inclination towards formation of meaning. So that's what Prakriti is. So the term becomes a key term for regional variations. For instance, Natya Shastra, of course, a play will have regional variations, of course. Also becomes a term for specific realities in locations, of course, natural locations that constitute this meaning. Now, when I said that ecology or ecological experience or perceptions or reflections upon environment and objects in the natural world is used as illustration as well as become constitutive in developing ideas about literature, ideas about language, Bhartrhari comes to mind, of course, 6th century. Bhartrhari, one of the early, of course, philosophers involved to establish that there is an arbitrary relation between the word and the meaning. As all of us know, that Saussure, of course, invariably, of course, there was a lot of influence, he being a professor of Sanskrit. Now, in order to establish that there is an arbitrary relation between word and meaning, between sound and meaning, Bhartrhari uses the reflection of moon on water bodies. And this also he does to argue that though the relationship between word and meaning arbitrary, yet it's only through word that we can actually make effort to reach nearer to meaning, which also gives an idea of silence in poetry, because there's silence in poetry because it's impossible for any poet to get the right word, the word, which is a sixth sense for a poet, and therefore there's always going to be a gap. Now, this all comes to him. I'm not saying this all comes to him because he uses it in Vakyapadyam by observing that the reflection of the moon on water is, of course, the waves in a lake or any water body that reflects the moon, of course, does not have the substratum of moons. So much so that the moon is not moving, but the water is moving. In other words, therefore, the relationship between word and meaning is not natural, arbitrary, but if one was in Platonic world, of course, of the cave, and that's what Bhartrhari perhaps is arguing, then the reflections in the water bodies are the only ways for us to access language. So what I'm trying to say is this, that this comes through a perception of nature, through perception of natural objects. Of course, Anandavardhan later on in 9th century, when he develops the theory of Dhvani, what he does is this, that Dhvani, the sound that is secondary to a sport, a meaning, he sort of picks up sound and makes it the quintessence of literature. That is Anandavardhan's almost revolutionary contribution, obviously, that he makes Dhvani, the sound, of course, by which he means there are different meanings and manifestations of Dhvani in poetry, like Vastu Dhvani, Alankar Dhvani, and Rasa Dhvani, which for instance, he says that cannot be translated. What he argues is this, that Dhvani is a quintessence. To do that, he goes on to different literary experiences, cultural experiences of the time, available in both Sanskrit and Prakrit, and always to articulate a subtle poetic form or subtle poetic idea. He, in fact, sees its manifestation in a natural, in a natural activity. For instance, he quotes the Buddhist philosopher Dharmakirti. It's ironical that the Buddhist philosopher Dharmakirti would actually be an author of an erotic verse, but that's what he does. I mean, that comes from the tradition of various extrapolations, perhaps, but this is what that's what Dharmakirti says, and quoted by Anandavardhan in Dhvanyaloka, "Oh, what mountain, on what mountain, for how long, and what was the name of his austerity? I mean, this little parrot, that he should bite into a cherry as pink as your lip." This is Bhartrihari's verse, obviously, and it talks about, it represents the experience of a lover and is with beloved and he sees this particular sight. Now, this Anandavardhan uses this experience, obviously, to articulate a category of dhvani, which, of course, which in the sense that, samlakshikaram dhvani, asamlakshikaram dhvani. So, asamlakshikaram dhvani is a category where, so unlike in the Western tradition, modernism, for instance, modernist theory of symbolism, Anandavardhan reflects on various possibilities of the literal meaning to transform itself into symbolic meaning. Here is one category in which, of course, the literal vanishes, in fact, literal vanishes and the symbolic illumines itself. Now, to do that, for instance, and this is an experiential, one of the major features of early Indian poeticians, literary theorists and philosophers is this, that their ideas, of course, they emanate from different forms of perceptions. In early Indian thought is that seeing is not simply seeing, but it's always seeing something as something. And that seems to be the crux, obviously. Now, all this idea, in fact, in a way, kind of originates in, as it was also mentioned by you, Purush and Prakriti, of course, Sankhya is the basic framework, obviously. And Sankhya, of course, it talks about the inseparability of mind and matter, of course, Purush and Prakriti. But one of the ideas that is germane to aesthetics, and that comes from Sankhya, is a concept of guna. Or the idea is this, that whether it's the objects in the natural world, and the philosophy of guna, of course, it says that, argues that even the self, the empirical self, shares its components with each and every component in the natural world, and therefore guna in nature and guna in the self is equal, and that is why in literature or in theater, the description or representation of nature and natural objects, the kind of impact it has in the human self, whether one is an audience or the reader of poetry, is because there is something which is not only intrinsic but originally common between those components that constitute various objects in nature, whether trees, whether stones, whether rivers, whether water. There is something, that the constituents are common, obviously, whether it is the mind, I mean, in terms of antaha karana, which is the empirical self, whether it's an intelligence or the hridaya, so hridaya or manu, for instance, or ego, the components that constitute all these are also the constituents that constitute the natural world, and that relationship is kind of is established between what is called as the tanmatras, of course, tanmatras and the bhutas. So tanmatras in the self and the bhutas out there in the natural world. Now, that is something which, of course, Bharata takes in Natya Shastra, where he talks about very beings, the ideas of Uddipana Vibhavas and Alambana Vibhava, obviously, in Natya Shastra. And where, of course, there is it also evolves out of the idea that the word rasa itself, the origin of ras in Rig Veda, of course, means the sap or the essence, of course, of different vegetation or fruits and vegetables. Is an idea that comes in the Rig Veda of rasa. It develops in Ayurveda, of course, that it takes upon the idea of property that particular herb or an object would have to cure a certain disease, and then it comes to literature, and then comes to philosophy, of course, where in philosophy the self itself kind of gets constituted of the objects in the world. Now, if I can read from the Svetastra Upanishad, of course, the same self is in the ant and in the elephant also. The same self pervades the universe. This universe also is infinite. And therefore, the self that is in an ant is also the self in the elephant is also the self in the poet is also the self in the Sahardaya. Now that is what it is in poetics, whether it's Abhinav Gupta, who of course explains rasa theory when he is actually commenting on Abhigyan Shakuntalam in order to kind of explain what is Bhayanak Rasa. He takes, of course, examples from nature. A last point, in Tinai poetics, for instance, where in Tolkappiyam, obviously, as you know, Tolkappiyam takes it in a much more kind of, the whole idea that the human emotion has a certain geographical manifestation. So if you have, if you're in the mountains, you're in the forest, when you're in desert, you're in wetland, obviously there are different experiences of feelings, and therefore poetic experiences or critical experiences, critical articulations are also therefore specific to where one is located in the environment. I'll close with again with what Professor Malashi Lal said, that I mean with Abhinav Ghosh, obviously in Great Derangement, the problem of course with climate crisis is a problem of disowning the non-human, the non-human. And in one of the Upanishads, I end with this, and of course Ghosh talks about going back to the classics, Indian classics as well as Greek classics, obviously. In one of the Upanishads, there is a student, I'm forgetting, because it's not something I thought, but one of the Upanishads, of course, is the, anyway, so is the disciple, the guru says that you of course go around and learn things from the world, and you have 100 cows. When the number of cows grow to 1,000, you come back. He comes back and he says that you seem to be Noah. What's the secret of your knowledge? He says the secret of my knowledge is that I have learned things from beings other than men, of course, other than humans. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I thank Sahitya Academy profusely, and Dr. and Srinivas Raoji and everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dhananjay. That was an absolutely fascinating way of looking at eco-criticism, and I'm so glad that you took us back to a range of classics and that you ended on the note of Amitav Ghosh. Because the point that I want to make here is that in India there has been a continuum of eco-criticism. It's not that we only wrote about nature and human relationships in the past and that there was any kind of a break. That tradition has continued. Also, I'd like to mention that eco-criticism is interdisciplinary. And we're seeing that in the work of, say, Amitav Ghosh, and along with that, somebody like Vandana Shiva, who is a scientist. So this link between humanities and science is very important. And Vandana Shiva's very recent book, this is her own autobiography, which she calls Terra Viva, My Life in a Biodiversity of Movements. This just came out in 2022. And it's an assessment of the science-nature conservation relationship. I'm just going to quote a line from Vandana Shiva where she says, privatization of the earth's resources, of water, of biodiversity, is the ultimate social and ecological violation of human rights. The very idea of owning life through patents, of owning and selling water through concessions and commodification is symptomatic of the deep regression of the human species. So this kind of a link is what we need to build through eco-criticism, and you've certainly set the premises in the right direction. So we move on to our next speaker, and this is Dr. G. Madhusudan.
Before we move on to G. Madhusudan, I would like to introduce the chair of the session. No. That's...
Honestly, really, let's have time. Let's have discussion.
Yeah, no, just few lines. Malashi Lal is a distinguished writer in English. She retired as Professor English Department, University of Delhi, and has 16 books to her credit. Her specialization is in literature, women, and gender studies. Her poems and stories have been published in journals such as Indian Literature, Confluence, The Beacon, online portals, and Anthology. She was a senior consultant to the Ministry of Culture and has served on International Book Award juries. She is currently convener, Sahitya Academy's English Advisory Board.
Published the first book of poetry. That's the 17th.
Oh.
As of last week.
Oh.
So let's move on to Dr. Madhusudan.
Yeah. So, G. Madhusudan is a prominent writer in Malayalam. He began his career in the Indian Administrative Service in 1976. He pioneered ecological literary criticism and eco-criticism in Malayalam. So far, he has published 10 books in Malayalam, out of which 5 are in the field of ecological literary criticism. For his writings in Malayalam, he has received 10 prestigious literary awards, including the Kerala Sahitya Academy Award. We welcome you, sir. Please come and share your views.
Respected Chair and friends, I complete 28 years in ecocriticism. I began in '95 when ecocriticism was officially launched in University of Colorado, where I was invited to present a paper. In fact, I presented a paper on ecofeminism and Malayalam, Indian short story actually, not Malayalam. So, but I decided to switch to my mother tongue because of the richness of ecological awareness in my mother tongue literature, Malayalam literature. So it was a considered decision to switch to Malayalam, even though I began with presenting a paper in English. Dhananjay said the right things about our tradition. In fact, there is a very famous novel in Malayalam called Madhuram Gayati, which articulates the Indian vision. It's by O.V. Vijayan. O.V. Vijayan, many of you may have heard because he's a bilingual writer. I have critiqued that novel internally. But my approach to criticism, literary ecological criticism is slightly different because I look at what has brought us to this predicament today. That's how I look at it. So I begin with a poem by Lord Byron, written in 1810. He was talking about the blueness of the sea. I took up the poem recently because of another reason, I'll come to that. He said, "Roll on, thou deep and dark blue ocean, roll. 10,000 fleets sweep over thee in vain. Man marks the earth with ruins. His control stops with the shore," he said. When he was writing, his mother country was on the waves of Atlantic Ocean, virtually establishing control all over the world. Thousands of fleets were on the Atlantic Ocean. So it was a contradiction how romantic poets approached nature when he couldn't see what devastation they were wreaking on the entire tropical world. It is not just the British. I am not blaming just the British, but the British did maximum devastation in the tropical world. The Spanish and the Portuguese first did in South America, and the British spread it to all over the world. In fact, I have written the environmental history of Kerala, for which I got the second Sahitya Academy Award in 2019. So I've read a lot of environmental history, so I can say with definite this thing that it was the colonialists who ruined our world, the tropical world. You look at, start from Spain, start from South America, you spread to everywhere, right up to Africa, India, everywhere. In fact, even in India, the damage the British has done is tremendous. From Kerala to Assam, you look at anywhere. So that's why I reject these romantic notions of, nature love and all. I try to look at what happened to us, why we moved away from our roots. And then I want to take a quantum, because I want to finish in the time. Madam has said 12 minutes. So I'll take a quantum jump to Bhopal now, because we are sitting in this city. I can't but mention that event in '84. 2nd and 3rd of December 1984. In fact, I have a historic connection with that event because the night before I was in a train going to Delhi. In fact, on 2nd and 3rd, people died in the trains here. So I was probably a victim. I was going back to join my job in the Government of India in the Department of Economic Affairs, where I was a Deputy Secretary at that time. So Indira Sinha's novel, you all know about that novel, Animals, People. And of course, recently I looked at another novel, Anjali Deshpande's Impeachment, which is again on. I looked at Hindi, but I couldn't find any novel in Hindi on the subject. So, but more than that, I think Indira Sinha's novel has been read by people. In fact, some Harvard studies are there on the novel. But I looked at Dominic Lapierre and Javier Moro's history of the gas tragedy. I find it a better eco-critical work, in fact. Even though Harvard critic has said Indira Sinha's novel did more to spread the idea of the tragedy of this gas tragedy in the world than any other writing. But I liked Dominic Lapierre's and Javier Moro's work because the connections it made. I'm talking about it because of the way I look at eco-criticism. Lapierre starts from a village in Orissa. I think he called it Madilappa or something. Madilappa or something. That's a village from an Adivasi village, and he traces the people who were staying near this Union Carbide factory, how they migrated from Madilappa to Bhopal. That was 1884 he was talking about, when railways first came to Bhopal. Bhopal was a sultanate at that time, run by a begum. The British were there. Of course, the British were establishing the railways. So they migrated because of the environmental crisis in the mountains they were living. They were looking for a job. They came here to work on the railways. Finally, they ended up in a slum near the Union Carbide plant. So a beautiful illustration of the environmental destruction in our mountains those time. He brings in the colonial period. He brings in the railways. Lapierre's evocation, I mean, it's as good as a novel. So I would think such writing also, I would call it eco-critical writing. And then, the study, Harvard study I mentioned is called Bhopal's Trials of Knowledge and Ignorance. It's by a author, I think her name, Sheila Jasanoff. It's an interesting study. It's not only on the novel, but she speaks about a whole lot of issues. Yes, that village name is Mudilappa. Sorry, I pronounced it wrongly. I have to skip a lot of things. I just made some points. Then how we ended up adopting the Western model of growth. That's a critical question, I think. Or how the entire world came to. They established a world system where they perpetrated their concepts of growth and industrialism all over the world. Even today, they continue to do that. In fact, that's why I sometimes tell some of my colleagues who write about post-colonialism that we don't live in a post-colonial world. We live in a neo-colonial world, because India, they cannot colonize, or even today, because we are a very strong country. We are almost a big power in the world today. But you look at Africa, you look at African history, even today, the way the West is ruining Africa is unimaginably, it's very unimaginable. So we live literally in a neo-colonial world where I would include not just the West, I would include countries like China, which are like, as Gandhiji said, like locusts. They are virtually ruining Africa today, China's presence in Africa. So it's not just the West. There are others also doing the same thing. So you address these issues, how we have come to this predicament. Why I talked about that blue ocean was because that book, that poem I took out and read when I was reading a scientific study on that 56% of our oceans are turning color. The color is turning into green. It's no more blue because of the poisons which are running into the sea. Also because climate change is changing the phytoplankton on the surface of the sea. So because I do this 24 by 365, because I run an organization working on climate change and sustainability. So that's my job profession, my profession. So every day I'm looking at new scientific studies on this. So that particular day before I was coming, I was looking at a study on this, that 56% of the sea is changing. It's no more blue. So are we to address this, or are we to just talk about the lost blueness of the sea? Or we look at the reasons why the color is changing? This is a very critical question for a writer, I think. Yeah, in fact, Lapierre makes so many connections. I think if you reread it, not just as a history of the gas tragedy, he talks about how pesticides are a product of oil, very interesting connections he makes. And because the other reason for our current predicament is the spread of fossil fuels in the world, how, the West took control of the Gulf literally, and they burnt all the oil. 80% of emissions, India did not pollute this world. The West did. 80% of emissions historically was done by the West. And they are today even unwilling to take responsibility for that. We talk about reparations every world. So that's how I think eco-criticism is, of course, a big umbrella. I think all of these views can be accommodated under eco-criticism. But if you see these connections of from colonialism to modernity to the current predicament, then you have to look at that literature also very differently. And even in India, I've been surveying Indian literature for the last, from other states also. Last few years, I'm just collecting actually whatever translations. I believe better literature is written in the regional languages because they are more close to the ground. I'm not disrespecting the Indo-Anglian writers. In fact, I'm a great fan of Amitabh Ghosh. So I'm not disrespecting that. But I think a lot of the writers who are there right on the ground in the regional literatures, they're writing much better literature on this ecological situation in our country or anywhere for that matter. Like, for example, one of the novels I recently acquired is from Africa, the writer called Helen Habila. He's writing on, the novel is called Oil on Water. Nigeria is an oil-rich country, one of the countries very rich in oil, but it's a very poor country. The people are very poor. The entire Niger Delta has been ruined by Western companies who are extracting oil in Nigeria. So Helen Habila's novel is based on that devastation wreaked by the multinationals. So this kind of new fiction coming out, in fact, African literature is extremely rich today, you look at. I'm talking about India. India has a great tradition. I can go back to 1947 even. We have a Malayalam poet called P. Kunyaraman Nair. And then, of course, my wife's grandfather, Mahakavi G. Shankara Kurup. So they have all been writing about these issues, in fact, since the independence time. Then you come to Bengal. Bengal has such a rich tradition of eco-literature. Then Shivram Karanji in Karnataka. There's so many, I'm mentioning just few. Recently, I have been surveying even destruction of Goa. It has been fictionalized by, I think Pundalik Naik is his name. He's written a novel on Goa's destruction. So across India, you survey, even in Northeast, many ecological novels are being written in Northeast, and they write in English. So there is no question of translation, it's available in English only. So this kind of looking at the paradigm we are following everywhere, all over the world, not just in India, and whether we can continue with this is a critical question I think writers are addressing and writers need to address. And I think eco-critics need to raise this issue, because when I began writing eco-criticism in Malayalam, a lot of people said it's not criticism. I established myself, that's a different story. But a lot of people felt it's not exactly typical literary criticism. But then I broke the barrier, and then, in fact, even today, for the people doing PhD in eco-criticism, my books are the only reference works in Malayalam. Yeah, I will just wind up now. So I have many more points, but since time is less, I'll wind up. Amitabh wrote, actually, Amitabh Ghosh's latest novel. I'll just conclude with that. I don't know whether you can call it a novel. It's called The Living Mountain. It questions this whole paradigm, this paradigm of growth. It's a novella, it's a short novella. I think that is where the crux of eco-criticism lies. And I decided to move away from where I started in eco-criticism, which was from the Western tradition. Because I was a member of the Global Association for many years. I stopped my membership because I found they have tied themselves to a Thoreauvian tradition, kind of metaphysical Thoreauvian tradition, and I found it very constraining that eco-criticism cannot be put in that stable of, Thoreauvian metaphysics. So writers are moving ahead. That's what I said. If you survey world literature today, anywhere from oil, there is in fact a big branch of eco-criticism today where we are looking at energy and the novel, Imre Zaman, there are so many authors. I can't go into all their aspects. But what I'm saying is eco-criticism has grown beyond our imagination, and it's perhaps the only branch of criticism which is prominent today. You look into the Amazon website, every day you are getting new books. In fact, Ma'am, I'm stopping in 1 minute. One of my latest acquisitions is a book called Mass Extinction and the Fiction, you know. So that's where we are reaching. So it's a fascinating subject, and I'm happy to be there, and I hope time allows me to write more on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're absolutely right. It's a fascinating and a very vast subject, and my apologies for cutting the writer short. I have a feeling that there's lots of questions that will come up once our significant presentations are over. But I completely agree with you that colonial education has had a role to play in disbanding the whole idea of a holistic critical tradition that India classically had. And I want to just for a minute turn attention to the folklore of India. It's not only the classical material and classical literature that Dhananjay talked about, and you talked about the role of a certain kind of literature from in Malayalam and also Amitabh Ghosh, but I can see people in the audience who worked on the folklore of India. You know, this is where you have talking trees. And there are Bhutni and Pitni that are living up there in the trees. And then I grew up in Rajasthan. And the river and whatever little water you have has a very important role to play in your survival. Now, in those areas and in those geographies of literature, one can never separate the human from the non-human. And that is where eco-criticism has been part of our living literature of the villages, of the folk traditions. Just wanted to flag that as an issue. So we move on to our next speaker, Dr. Om Dwivedi.
Om Dwivedi is Associate Professor of English Literature and Dean, School of Liberal Arts at Bennett University, Greater Noida, Uttar Pradesh. He is the author of Representations of Precarity in South Asian Literature in English, Reorientalism and Indian Writing in English, and Tracing the New Indian Diaspora. His latest publication includes a special issue of the Journal of Commonwealth Literature on Partition 75 Years On, and a special issue of Metacritic Journal on Hope and Utopia in Global South Literature. He is the Vice Chair of the International Research Group Challenging Precarity, UK. So we welcome you, sir. Om, sir.
Respected Chair, Professor Malashri ma'am, my esteemed fellow panelists, Dhananjay ji, Professor Madhusudan and Professor Sayantan ji, and all distinguished guests present here. I will be talking about the notion of interrelatedness or interconnectedness as the baseline condition of planetary life. So much of what I'm going to talk about has already been foregrounded by the chair and Dhananjay ji. So of late, there has been a deluge of seminars and conferences on themes pertaining to environment, climate, and sustainability. And yet, if we witness the material conditions around us, we find that we are nowhere close to addressing that lurking threat that awaits us. The kind of threat that may annihilate in all forms of life on this planet, which we also try to capture it in this term, that the sixth mass extinction of the planet. The phenomenology, and there is a reason to it, because if we look at the phenomenological events that are happening around us, for example, the acidification of oceans, the death of non-human species, almost 150 per year, the loss of lands around us, the genetically manipulated food, the increased rate in terms of the forest fires that are happening in different parts of the world. They are all proofs that we have failed in our collective imagination to strike a kind of a symbiotic relationship with non-human species, for that matter. We may have succeeded in building our own world, but in doing so, we have remarkably failed by excavating and even diluting the planetary health and planetary life. So when we talk about planetary life, the problem that confronts much of the environmental thinking is the problem that it is largely anthropocentric. So we end up talking about humans. Environmental thinking, however, is not about you and me. It is not about any particular ideology or any particular nation, or for that matter, it is also not about any about purity and impurity that we are so obsessed with. It is not about any demagogue. It goes beyond human existence because life preceded humans. Life was there when there were no human beings around us. So planetary life in that sense, it requires, I argue, a kind of a radically creative alliance that seeks to foster and promote networks of care, structures of dependency, and equitable access to natural resources, for that matter. And seen in this way, one can argue that planetary life is also, it is not just about our ability to share, but also about our ability to care and preserve life for future generations to come. Life, as we witness and as we understand, is a series of encounters between humans and non-human species, between visible and invisible creatures, organisms, and particles and chemicals for that matter. And that brings us to the vital issue, that the notion of interrelatedness or interconnectedness that underpins this planetary life. For example, bacteria that is found inside us, they are very useful in digesting food. They have their own roles to play. In another sense, we take the example of planktons, the microorganism that is found beneath the ocean. They have their own role to play. They maintain the oxygen level in the atmosphere. So we can see that it's not the humans who are protecting the species, rather the non-humans which are creating and sustaining and even nourishing life conditions for us. This brings me to a very riveting passage from Tavish Khair's latest novel, The Body by the Shore. And Khair points out, I'll quote, "We were told that we are individuals, we are unique. It turned out that we are teeming with organisms inside us, on us, and that they affect us in ways that we are only beginning to understand. We are not just part of an ecosystem, we are ourselves an ecosystem. Every individual self is a teeming ecosystem which relates to the larger ecosystem in which it thrives, survives, or perishes. The sages had said this something long time back. The scientists are saying it now," unquote. Of course, what Khair foregrounds has already been prefigured in many of the ancient Indian texts. For example, the principle of Panch Mahabhuta, which also promotes this idea of interrelatedness. For example, it says that from Brahma arises space, from space arises air, from air arises fire, from fire arises water, and from water arises earth. However, with this, what Sir said, the commodification of life, and also what Mala ma'am pointed about, the accelerating rate of our deteriorating life conditions, they have all led to a kind of a condition where we witness a kind of a deterioration of our symbiotic relationship with other forms of life. And this is largely a result of the rise of liberal Enlightenment humanism. For example, if we look René Descartes' work on method, he goes on to say that the purpose of knowledge is to bend nature for man's purpose. In the same vein, Alexander Pope goes on to say that nature and nature's power lay hid in night. God said, "Let Newton be," and there was light. Light there was, but that light turned out to be highly racialized one, because it was all focused on one particular area and on selective skins, thus throwing other regions and other populations into deplorable conditions. Even it led to a kind of a creation and persistence of an era of darkness, to use a term from Shashi Tharoor. This self-serving interest can be seen in all narratives that we encounter, as ma'am pointed out, since the beginning of environmental criticism in 1978. The problem is that there is not just an issue of neo-colonialism, it is also an issue of environmental racism. And this comes out very forcefully if you read Lawrence Summers' account, a secret letter that was not meant for the public. And he says, he was the then president of the World Bank in 1991, he says, and I quote him, "I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. I have always thought that countries in Africa are vastly underpolluted. Their air quality is probably vastly inefficiently low compared to Los Angeles. Just between you and me, shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to the least developed countries?" Unquote. This ontological insecurity rendered to nature and natural resources is, of course, I argue, is a direct consequence of a flawed notion of time. The notion of time that the West believes in, the kind of a temporality, which is in stark contrast to the circularity of notion that Indian philosophy upholds and promotes. When we believe in the temporality, we are also led to believe in our sense of finitude, that we have only a limited sense of time on our hands. And this has actually been driving the entire Western narrative, because this had led to a kind of an intensified rationalism, because there is an acute sense of crisis, which has led to an accentuated form of awareness on the self, which subsequently has led to a kind of a disengagement from the other. And this ultimately has brought us to the position of the kind of environmental catastrophe that we are witnessing presently. Ma'am, I have time?
Yeah, a few more minutes.
Okay, fine. That's why also there is a larger narrative going on about lifeboats available for a selective group of people, or also about settling on Mars without bothering or without bothering to mend their ways while we are all here. So this marks, I argue, a shift from our sense of duty to a sense of, to the claims of rights. This is very common parlance in the Western knowledge system, that you create a crisis and then you start finding ways to resolve it. Of course, that resolution also is very manipulative and also very selectively done. So the birth and emergence of centers of human rights, or for that matter, centers on environmental humanities, they all came to the fore only in the late 1980s. They were not there earlier. So in many ways, they are all creation of the flawed and the self-centric, I would say, interest of the Western civilization. Guha and also his fellow writer, Joan Martinez, they go on to make a very interesting point. They say that the fate of environmentalism in days to come will be decided, will be marked by a tension between full stomach and empty stomach environmentalism. And full stomach and empty stomach means there will be a kind of an ongoing clash between highly developed nations and least developed nations that is already ongoing. Because, sir pointed out China, but China is producing all the nuts and bolts for the US. So automatically when that happens, the carbon emission rate of China shoots up. So there are various interlinked things that are visible and invisible within this environmental catastrophe. I will stop it here. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Om Dwivedi, for the very fascinating journey that you took us on to look at the planetary crisis in a different and a larger context. I want to pick on this idea of how do we measure time. Because that again, when we are talking of eco-criticism, how can I let the session go without talking of ecofeminism? So, so I do want to mention, as I was preparing for the session, that I began to think about the Baramasa. Because in India, we have in classical as well as in folk, through literature, music, and painting, looked at the year and the progression of time through the concept of the Baramasa. And what is the Baramasa? It is a predictability of the seasons and what you expect in that season and what kind of human action, mainly romantic love, that you can indulge in the context of the seasonal changes. And of course, most of the Baramasas that we know of through literature are women-centric because they talk about the lament of the woman that the beloved is not there. But at the same time, there are Baramasas which celebrate the union of love, man and woman. But the concept of the Baramasa is from the early Middle Ages to right now. People are still writing Baramasa, and it also transcends the division of rural, urban. It overlooks the idea of any kind of gender differential. So I just thought I would mention that as an extension of the idea that you gave us, Om, as to how do we measure time. Because if we feel we control time, then there's one attitude. If we feel that we are subjecting ourselves and our choices of action within a framework of a seasonal change, then the mindset is different. So maybe move on to the last speaker for the session, Professor Sayantan Dasgupta.
Sayantan Dasgupta teaches comparative literature at Jadavpur University and is coordinator Center for Translation of Indian Literature there. He was a member, Advisory Board English of Sahitya Academy and Secretary of the Comparative Literature Association of India. His latest publications is the edited volume celebrating the city, Kolkata, in Indian literature. Among other volumes of translation, he has edited are Call of the Hills, Tamang Selo, to mention a few. He is author of Indian English Literature, a study in historiography and Shyam Silavadiri text and contexts. So with these lines, I would like to invite Professor Dasgupta. Please come.
The fag end of today, and there's no way I'm going to present a paper at this time. What I'll do is, I'll just make a few brief comments and then try to introduce a body of literature which I think has immense significance for eco-criticism. And it is a body of literature which has not reached too many outside the source language, the language in which this body of literature was composed, primarily because very little of this has been translated. And Maladi, of course, has this way of giving us just the right cue at the right time. And I'll take her cue for this presentation, which is she was talking about how there is a long and continuous tradition of eco-criticism in India, and that percolates into the different bhashas across time, across languages, across spaces. She was talking about the folk tradition, which is very important in this context. I'm going to talk about something that can be called Sundarbans literature. The Sundarbans, as we know, is this mangrove region in the Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna delta, and it extends into part of Bangladesh as well as covers part of India. Parts of this region are relatively isolated and are deprived of the fruits of development. To many, the Sundarbans is almost equivalent to tiger sightings and sightings of crocodiles because it's a tourist destination also. But the Sundarbans also mean much more than just tigers and crocodiles. If one takes on the Sundarbans from the point of view of ecological anthropology and try to understand indigenous responses to ecological systems as embodied in Sundarbans fiction, there is much, I think, that we can gain out of this kind of a reading. So Amitav Ghosh has, of course, very, very powerfully spoken about the Sundarbans, and there's so much that we can glean from what he has written in terms of eco-criticism. Side by side with Amitav Ghosh and many others, I think there extends this parallel tradition, perhaps, which has been in existence in Bangla, where people have been writing from the Sundarbans about lives, lifestyles in the Sundarbans, about the relationship between the human world and the natural world as it pertains in this part of the world. Very recently, we brought out the first ever anthology of Sundarban stories in English translation called Writings from the Sundarbans, which Indranil Acharya co-edited with me. And here we could take 23 short stories and one oral narrative from the Sundarbans, written by people, writers who were either from the Sundarbans or who had a connection with the Sundarbans. And I think many of these stories are very important to take cognizance of, because not only do they document local lives and lifestyles, but they also present us with certain views and perspectives on the human world, natural world relationship. Also, through depicting local lives and lifestyles, these stories also do something else. Many of these stories textualize folk or oral texts that are given a fresh lease of life in print, and that evidence the knowledge system of the inhabitants of this part of the world. Niranjan Mondol, for instance, is one such writer who has extensive experience with gunins, with different kinds of local traditions, and he actually has collected all these proverbs, these verses, these incantations, and he works all of these texts into the body of his short stories. And each of these prayers, mantras, they tell us something about how people envisage their relationship with the natural world, what kind of a symbiosis exists to them. As we all know, indigenous people are perhaps overtly conscious about the need to preserve the ecological balance, and that comes across in literature from all over the world. We remember Takari's Chamin, for instance, where we find the fishing people who do not go out into the sea, Kadalamma, when the water is red. That's part of the mechanism that prevents overconsumption, overfishing. We can also remember other contexts from even outside India, for instance, with the indigenous Canadians, when you talk about places like Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump, where the hunt is portrayed as not an act of cruelty, but as an act of self-sustenance. So before the hunt, you would actually go and pray to the buffalo spirit, saying, this is something I'm doing not because I want to do it, but because I need this to survive. So that kind of a particular logic of ecological balance is something that comes across, I think, in the writings from the Sundarbans also. I will try to talk us through a couple of stories from here and try to identify some of the things which I think make these stories important for us to take cognizance of. The story by Joy Krishna Koyal, which we translated as The Second Death, is about a group of 7 men who have gone to harvest timber in the jungle. As we know, the Sundarbans, the land of the Sundarbans is not very fecund, ek fashla jumi. It yields one yield in a year. So many of those who inhabit this part of the world actually subsist partly on agriculture, partly on harvesting timber from the forest, braving the attacks of the tigers, and partly on collecting honey, mole jara, the people who are the moles. And collecting honey, collecting timber, all of these are very risky occupations. And the risks associated with this and the balance that the risk and the gain factor, all of this comes through in these stories. This group of 7 men had gone into the jungle to get timber, and they are returning when this story begins. And we learn that one of these men had actually got his hand into a tiger's mouth. The tiger had come to drag him off, but somehow the tiger got distracted and he is coming back alive. That's the crux of the story. But I think what is very important is that even as these people are returning, we are given a picture of the myths that are associated with this community. They are singing the songs which are supposed to keep these people safe when they go on a tiger hunt. Also, there is this concern about how much timber they can harvest. I'll read out a small section. Despite their best efforts, they had failed to get a pass sanctioned for either garan or any other precious timber this time. You need a pass to go into the jungle and get wood. They only got the pass to collect hetal, which is a much cheaper variety. But all of them had made up their minds that they would stack the boat with precious timber. Then they would camouflage the timber with some hetal logs strewn above to fool the patrol officers of the forest department. So there's this intrinsic conflict that is built into the story about, on one hand, to survive, but on one hand, the urge to take a little bit of money back home. And this man who is in love with this woman, he has promised her a nose ring, because a woman shouldn't go around without a nose ring. That's part of the mythology of this community. So there is that on one hand. And on the other, there is also this consciousness that you cannot go overboard. You need to preserve so that there is more for later. We also find that when they anchored the boat at the edge of the forest, out of habit, he had chanted the appropriate mantras to check whether the soil was warm. This is a technique unique to the Gunins. They can sense things by touching the soil after reciting certain chants. The possibility of any danger or the presence of Boromia is the tiger, around makes the soil feel warm. Otherwise, it feels normal to the touch. So these are all part of the knowledge system, the stories, the myths that are part of the belief system of this community, which are woven into the fiction over here. Again, there are dreams, fantasies that come back. And again, these dreams, fantasies can be read at various levels. For instance, sometimes it happens that when these people go into the jungle to get timber, maybe they get the timber, they cut the trees, but then they have these recurrent dreams. Dreams where Ma Bono Bibi is one of the presiding deities of the jungle, comes into the dream and warns them, yes, you have cut the timber, but this timber does not belong to you. I have kept it for someone else who will come later. And so they cannot take that timber back home. So that's something that is in the realm of the fantastic, but it's also an idea that connects with the idea of preserving the ecological balance and preventing over-harvesting, overuse. Human greed is something that needs to be balanced, it seems. At the end of this story, of course, we see the patrol boat does come in, and faced with this threat, they have nothing to do. All is to be given up. But this man who is so deeply in love with this woman cannot let go. So he becomes violent, he loses his cool, and finally, the river, the natural world which sustains them, it is the same natural world that actually consumes them. So he ends up in the water, finally. Another story by Niranjan Mondol, I was mentioning him a little earlier. This focuses on the shrimp catchers of the Sundarbans. It's called the shrimp catchers of the mangrove forest. Here again, the focus is on the Raimongol. Gainpara is a village on the bank of the Raimongol. And Rakhal, who is one of the shrimp catchers, is about to go into his act of getting the shrimp. And his mother tells him, Rakhal, now cast the spell. These days the water is infested with crocodiles and sharks. Throw 3 clods of earth in 3 directions of the river. It will bind the jaws of the crocodiles and the sharks with a magic charm. And then you can safely get into the river and haul your net. So these are part of the belief system of the people who embark on these professions. And all of these are documented and collected in this fiction. And again, there is this common theme of the fields drying up. There is not enough crops to be produced there, which is why one has to take to cutting of timber, catching shrimp. So once again, a pointer to the direction in which our environment, our climate is going. And one last point. There is also this passage over here where we learn about how shrimps used to fetch good money earlier, but now they don't. That is because the babus who buy these shrimplets are now cultivating them themselves. So they are getting into the production process. So naturally, the people who are actually collecting these shrimplets, the demand for their shrimplets has reduced now. Which means in order to earn the same amount of money that they were earning earlier, they have to do much more of shrimp catching. So there you have again this process of this vicious circle, overconsumption and overfishing, which is going to lead us where we only know. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anton, for taking us on this journey to the Sundarbans. And it's very interesting to see how areas like Sundarbans and certain parts of Africa are coming back into mainstream discourse with admiration for the practices that they have had. Earlier, there were words which sort of denied the dignity of these communities, and they were seen as so-called backward and sort of pre-modern, non-modern, resistant to modernity. And today we have come to a situation, well, thanks to the broad spectrum of eco-criticism, if you want to use that word, they've actually showing the way. And of course, it's a very deep subject. And for instance, the figure of Bon Bibi is a very fascinating one. But I, of course, will not go into any details right now. The floor is open for any observations and questions. And if we can keep them brief, we can get through a fair amount of additional knowledge and information for this session. Please go ahead. How do you understand that?
Well, I've written a whole book on
I
it.
know.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of you were talking about very relevant things, of course, but often what you lose out is you choose the examples which are the easiest to access, which is fiction. Short stories and extracts from novels. Yeah, so, but there's a lot going on in poetry. Yes. It's always been there. In fact, Amitabh Ghosh himself said that, Indian writers have been writing about this area, but one had to point it out that, in poetry there are many, many examples. You have to go back from Michael Madhusudhan Dattu, even now it's there. Also in popular cultures like songs.
Yes.
We forget that that's part of our ritual of literature. And certain kinds of song and song making is also part of this palette. So in any case, I mean, I've written the book, I've written a sequel to this, but people in India take it much, they come to it much later. First there has to be criticism abroad and then.
Yes, please. Did you want to say something? Yeah.
Actually, I'm from Bihar.
Go ahead.
One festival, Sama. I don't know if you have heard what. So, just sir said, now we are singing one song, and here we are saying
You just correlated. Yeah.
These are very relevant
Yeah.
points that we remind ourselves of songs, of poetry, of cultural practices. I don't know if Shuljukta or Ramkumar want to say something about this massive and wonderful book that you did on the folklore. And so much of it has to do with the kind of interrelationships that we're talking about between the human and the non-human. Any particular point that you'd like to make?
Is Ramkumar's book we should talk about? No, please go ahead. No, but that's, the concentration of that and what we are talking about in terms of eco-criticism.
Do you need a mic? Yeah. Go ahead. Okay, you have to go to the airport. Please. Please.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that it's a word that manifests into generic distinction in ways and very interesting to look at it. Because I think one of the earlier texts says that the entire world is a never-aging poem. That also comes from the English of it. It's a world that gets into literature that informs.
When there was no technology.
Yeah.
So, yes, actually, when we are thinking of folk narratives and eco-criticism, I somehow feel right now in the 21st century, in terms of the presentations, very rightly you chose Dhananjay to make that first presentation. So, historically we have been seeing the evolution in terms of criticism about eco-criticism. And when we are looking at the folk narratives again, what we have to remind ourselves always is the difference between the agrarian economy and also the evolution which has led not only to industrialization, but what we are now celebrating, or whether we should celebrate the fourth industrial revolution. And again, there are these disparities, as he said, about the full stomach and the hungry stomach. And the full stomach can only feel hungry with bicarbonate of soda. Yes? So, this is not me, really. It is Ernest Hemingway. So, therefore, we are looking at a very, very complex world. And to look at it in a very linear way in terms of certain descriptive ecological evidences, I suppose is a little restricted. But in terms of the book that you have referred to, Folk Narratives, that, however, is a sort of research which is unprecedented, and I can't take any credit for it, because my role has been to be an editor and also a translator. But in terms of Ramkumar going down there to the ground as such and collecting all that material, getting them translated into Bangla, and the number of languages is how many? 54 languages. The only other folk narrative that exists, which is widely celebrated, is Ramanujan's book, which has 23 languages. And Ramkumar has done this work, and if it was done in the University of Chicago, then probably they sort of, you know what, in terms of its publicity internationally, would have been far more stronger. I feel that we need to notice the difference that 23 by Ramanujan in the 1960s and 54 languages. So again, that evolution from Ramanujan to Ramkumar, which is much more trendy, like a Bollywood star. Yeah? So yes, therefore I feel that, eco-criticism has become very problematized, and as Madhusudan pointed out, he was looking at it the way in which the world is looking at it nowadays, when we are thinking in terms of climate change, climate crisis, and also about all the inequalities which environmentalism is bringing forward. Yes, and just like none of us referred to Vibhuti Bhushan, but that's a fantastic novel, Aranyok, that is really about that close, intimate communion with nature. It's a fantastic novel, as all of us who have read that in Bangla. But we have moved a lot from there. As you pointed out about Bhopal tragedy. Why should it have happened in the first place? Yes? So I think I will not be in a position to comment on all this. I'm glad that such a session has been conceived by Sahitya Academy, and today we are having this very dynamic interaction. Thank you.
Wonderful. So that with that, we can bring this wonderful session and very thoughtful session. Sorry. Sorry, go ahead, Shiva.
I just want to say one thing to Madhusudan. You said there is no literature on Bhopal tragedy. There's a fantastic play which Habib Tanvir did. It's called Zahrili Hawa. It's Zahrili Hawa. That's the last play he did. And also, Maharaji, I'm reminded of this Videsiya tradition in Bihar, with this whole tradition of Videsiya songs, which is a new genre of expression which was created by the Bhojpuri writer, Bikari Thakur, that talks about how urbanization encroaches lives in villages. And also in Kannada, we talk about folklore as ageless, but if I look at two great Dalit epics of Karnataka in the 18th century, they are addressing the question of the devastation of the earth by tyrants. And in one of them, an untouchable saint called Madhaya, he challenges Samanadore, who has conquered the whole world and who's made all gods his slaves. Ganapati is his astrologer, and Lakshmi is, fanning him and things like that. And he uses as his weapon the sandals made from the burning flesh, and he destroys the tyrant. So this epic was composed probably in 17th, 18th century. There could be many such epics, local traditions, which I've been talking about it.
So actually, I think what I seem to be taking away from this session is the complexity and the depth of the subject of eco-criticism. If we look at it in the context of the Indian traditions from various parts of the country and cut across from the classical to the folklore and the oral, and also not just written literature, but also music and painting. And that makes me feel that, there is, as one of you mentioned, a kind of primacy given to the written word that comes out of the Western publishing and marketing scenario. One of the books that's been doing the rounds, and this is Timothy Clark. This is a 2019 book, Timothy Clark's book, which is called The Value of Eco-Criticism. And I'm just reading a sentence to say that I think this is a very limited way of looking at eco-criticism. I'm quoting from the book. Eco-criticism's goal can be described as that of some state of human freedom in which non-human life is fully recognized, no longer violently exploited, nor its resources abused or exhausted. I mean, this seems like a very, very outsider point of view of eco-criticism, but what each of the speakers today has presented, and so many of you from the audience have added to that corpus of knowledge, is that it goes deep into our history, our culture, and our practices and our beliefs, that the natural world is composed of much more than just human presence, and that there are many communities have not lost that touch. And today we are trying to go back to that knowledge system in order to have a more holistic view of where our mere existence now depends on. So I'm very, very grateful to all the speakers and to the wonderful members of the audience for this scintillating session. Thank you very much for comparing this.
Thank you so much, ma'am, and all the speakers today. And thank you to all the audiences who have taken interest and asked questions, because a session looks good when there is an interaction. Thank you so much. So with this, we end today's session. And yes. You all please join us for the group photograph here.
Ecocriticism is a very inclusive subject.
So let's have an inclusive photograph. Please come ahead.
Everybody come here. Who's going to take the photo? Who's going to take the photo? Right here in the front. Didi sir in the front. You're going to take the photo. हम लोग आगे आ जाओ. आ जाओ. आ जाओ. आ जाओ. आ जाओ. स्पीकर के पास आ जाओ. सेशन का फॉर्म फोटो होना है. आप you come come. Shankar has to take a flight. You come on, everybody join.
Yes, yes. You have a call? You have a call?
I am also actually shifting to, actually my next book, English is my first.
Oh, okay.